Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we're talking about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Somewhere Between. So in this episode, we pick up where last week's episode left off with Nico kind of like, hearing Danny talk about the fact that it's like, oh man, you're the one that did it. Nico, you got drunk and everything, and Nico's starting to believe it. And the crazy thing about it is, in this episode, like, I feel like we saw Nico kind of get a little drunk. We see him black out a little bit. We never saw Nico the way he was in that flashback. Like, he's a mean drunk. It seems like it's in a common, like, it seems like it's a lot of things stacked upon it. So it's not something we really got to dive into, but it's just like, we saw it in that instant. It's so crazy because that's not the same Nico that we've experienced, but it kind of explains the why, like, a combination of, like, him beating up that suspect. It's like, it was more so like, hey, like, he was drunk at the time, lower inhibitions and stuff like that, so he kind of did whatever he wanted to. So, and we even saw at one point during like his argument with Susan, he was going to hit her if Danny hadn't grabbed onto him and stopped him. And it's crazy to see, one of our heroes like that, I mean, I guess it's also to show you he is flawed, and that's why he's so easy willing to believe it. He's like, I was a terrible person. He's kind of hidden, like he's never really talked about what really went down the night Suzanne died, and we kind of got to see that, like, because like he was going to propose to her, but they were going through issues at the time, and she's almost like, you're going to propose to me, even though the things have been the way they are. Really, you think that's going to fix everything, make it work? So he's even getting pissed at Danny and Suzanne. He's like, oh, if you want like Danny so much, why don't you just be with Danny? So they even have Danny apologizing and stuff like that. So it's really sad that things kind of broke down like that. So it's like, especially on his front, on that front too, because at the same time, it's like, Danny thought he was covering for Nico, so it makes that a little more insulting. It's like he kind of treated his brother like crap, and his brother is like, I'm taking the rap for this crime for your sake because you're the one that killed Susanna. But then it's like but obviously that's not the case. Like it does seem like I brought up last week's episode, like more like Danny's probably like lying again just for the sake of trying to protect Nico, because like much like those guys from the last episode showed up. Those two guys from last episode showed up and talked to Tom this episode. At some point, they probably got to Nico, or the person behind, not Nico, got to Danny, and who's ever behind them, or maybe the person in charge directly went to Danny. But nevertheless, it's probably like, you get your brother to back down, because they know him and Laura have been going around asking too many damn questions. So get them to back down, or we're going to hurt your family. So, because things don't line up. I mean, obviously, like, they end up talking with Grace later on in the episode, and kind of all this different information and stuff is coming out. Like, there are statements from Danny from his confession, but you look at him, like, he uses the exact same metaphor word for word. So it's like, no, he got coerced into his confession. Then you also see the pictures from jewelry that belonged to the victims, but the fact of the matter is, remember, the victim's family members, like that one of the victims, her brother, didn't recognize. And at the time, I was like, maybe he was forced to kind of lie about it. But now it's like, this is definite proof that Debray was the one that killed these women. There's no way Danny could have. So, and at the same time, during that whole situation, Nico still believing like, oh, it might have been him. He was passed out at the time. So once again, it's like going back to the question of like, who did Danny see? Like, is he outright lying, or did he mistake someone for Nico? Which I highly doubt that is the case, but it does seem like it might be going back to the former, like I mentioned earlier, like that he is just outright lying because someone's forcing him to. Because Nico was passed out at the bar around the time of Suzanne's murder. So, and another interesting thing to me too is the fact is that Grace never once brought up the scarf, which I guess in her defense, I guess like now she's kind of blocked it from her head, because she's like, no, I was thinking too much. I was being crazy about this whole situation. Like, that wasn't the scarf. There's no way it would have been the scarf that was involved in Suzanne's murder. So I get, because she didn't once bring it up to Nico or Laura. So. But I mean, it's kind of interesting seeing her in like a good position for once, because like, she's always been the one that's 100% been the only person that's like, oh, Danny's innocent, and now she has two other people on her side and they're working to prove Danny's innocent. So, but the sad thing is, with even all these new revelations, I mean, obviously there's still dual sad sides to everything. Even if it wasn't Nico that killed her, Nico still blames himself, because Suzanne was in that situation to be attacked by the fourth guy. If he is a killer, he might not be the actual killer. He might just be kind of the guy that covers things up, but might have actually been someone else that actually killed Suzanne. But nevertheless, like, she would have never been in a position to get killed if it wasn't for him, because she followed him into town trying to, probably make up for him after their big argument. He was there getting drunk and making out with the bartender, and that's what made her walk off on her own to be isolated like that. So put her in that position. So he blames himself, because if he had not been like getting all drunk and just like not done what he did, Susanna may have went in there and talked to him, and maybe they could have worked things out, or maybe she definitely wouldn't have been alone. That's the thing. So I mean, and that actually makes the situation even sadder too, because it's like, that's like the last thing, like Suzanne, probably one of the last things Suzanne saw before she died was like the whole, like the man that she's loved, no matter how much of an issue they have, like she still loved Nico and cared for him. And it's like to see that, and that's one of the last things that, and I'm sure on Nico's part, that's got to sting a little bit too, that like that douchebag side of him is the last thing, like, last memory Suzanne would have had of him, I mean, because the interesting thing about this is, and it's kind of what Laura kind of puts out there too, like the fact of the matter is, like, we shouldn't split up, because this is why Destiny brought us together, because you are tracking down the man who actually killed Suzanne, and I'm tracking down the man that's going to, possibly kill Serena, which in the time frame of this episode is still like 2 days away. Well, not just still, only 2 days away. Because for her, she understands what Nico's going through. Because the moment, like what happened with Serena, because she was so caught up in her own work, she didn't actually drop Serena off outside of the station herself, and give her to bury herself. She had someone else do it, and she wasn't there because she was so caught up in her own work. So that. She lived with that mistake has haunted her ever since, so she understands what Nico is going through. So, but another big thing in this episode was Nico finding out about. I think the cop's name is Cutner, but obviously he refers to his friend as Cupcake. Figuring him out, and it's kind of interesting because basically this whole situation got Nico looking at it from a different perspective on many different things. It's like, well, Danny didn't kill Suzanne, but then how did his DNA end up on like all this stuff? And it's like, oh, someone planted it there. Then he starts thinking about the day like the person who killed the Bray on the bike got away. It's like, the fact is, Cupcake missed. And it's like, you don't miss. You're actually the best shot here. And he ends up, to bring the proof, he calls up. Like, oh, yeah, evidence about a glove of blood. Oh, it didn't get in there. Oh, I think, and it's so interesting. I mean, for Nico, too, because Nico ends up bringing up the fact is that him and this guy have been friends him and Cupcake have been friends since he was a kid. Since he was like 8 years old. And it's like, you're doing this to me. You're doing this not only to me, but my brother. And at the same time, it's like, I completely misunderstood Cupcake's whole situation. I thought like he had a son or something that was kind of involved in all this. Apparently, it seems like what he was covering up is all the shady stuff he's done, like skimming some money off the top. He's giving like criminals a little warning before like police raid a certain place. So all that kind of got drudged up by whoever is big into this whole situation and is basically blackmailing him. And the reason why he did planted Danny's DNA was because he actually was like, oh, Nico, you said it was your brother. You believed it. So I was like, in his mind, it's like, oh, it's not that bad of a thing because we're just putting some evidence that's already there, like Danny's guilty, so it's okay. I guess you could argue he was justifying it, in some shape or form. Or maybe he thought like, hey, it's an okay thing to do because it's like we're putting away someone who killed a lot of people. Maybe that's one way he looked at it. But it's actually sad that he actually ended up killing himself like that. I was thinking like what was going to happen is that Nico's going, like before he even like was like, oh, figured it out. It's like, oh, it's pointed out that it's him. I thought at first he's gonna like, oh, I think it's a captain, and then Cupcake's gonna like, wait, you really think it's the captain who did it, or their lieutenant or whatever? And I thought that was gonna be like the thing, and he's gonna feel like he's safe or whatever. But turns out that's not the case. I mean, it's almost morbid too, like the conversations Nico has, like, oh, he's checking his body for the phone, and he's actually sitting there talking to him. He's like, man, you were like my brother. The fact is, I used to come over to your place and your mom makes sandwiches for us, when things kind of got too messy for me at home and stuff like that. It was like, it's so weird seeing that. It's almost like half remorseful, but I think at the same time, like, it's a combination of like, this was someone that's important to you, but at the same time, this same important person helped put your brother in jail and puts him in a position to be executed, for like the past 10 years, made him go through all of this. So I think some of that sympathy kind of goes away in that point. But even going later on, using his body as kind of a prop when meeting up with the tattoo biker dude, which interestingly enough, I could be wrong, but isn't that the actor who played Clay in the show Bitten? I think that might be him. I could be wrong. Nico got pretty messed up in that tussle though. Like he ends up having like a messed up arm because it got slammed into the door. But he did grab a piece of the dude's hair. So, but obviously another pretty big point in this episode was Tom and Laura meeting and having a sit down after she found the rings and everything, and him trying to lie and manipulate Serena. And that whole situation ending the way it did, like I thought was kind of, he's like, okay, I'm gonna tell you everything, I'm gonna tell you the truth. I was like, okay. And he's like, Jesse brought the evidence and stuff like that. I was like, oh, why did Jesse wait till now if he had the evidence? It's like, oh, he was scared and everything. I was actually starting to believe it until Laura pointed out, he's like, yeah, you're so full of shit. He's like, we're both on the same side here. I was like, really? What's up with all those conversations you had on the phone seeming like you were getting something out of this whole situation? And then Laura's like, unbelievable. He's like, see, told you. Now if you could give me a ring. She's like, no, what's unbelievable is that you actually think I'm gonna believe you. Like you're spewing all this horse crap. It's like, you want to know how I know you're lying? And he's like, how? Because it's basically said, like, I don't remember what her exact words were, but basically it's like, you're opening your mouth, that's how I know you're lying. And then I was like, dude, because I was about to say, like, I was halfway believing him about the whole Jesse situation, which Laura had brought up multiple good points. For one, it's like, why steal the rings if you were trying to help out in this whole situation, the jewelry in the first place? You're the one that was kind of all about not letting, like, things, like the moment Laura was like, okay, we need to push these people. Maybe you're not looking at the jewelry. Like the moment, like Laura wanted to keep pressing, Tom's the one to kind of pulled her back from it. So there's that. Plus, he didn't get the scarf until like well before Jesse died. But I guess for him, I was like, well, they don't really know the timeline of when he actually had it and everything. So I guess I guess he could skate around it with that lie because, Laura wouldn't really know the real detail. I mean, because granted, like arguably, maybe there is some truth to that. Maybe that is why Jesse came to visit him, was because he wanted to tell the truth, but he didn't realize Tom was connected to all this. So Tom warned the person that's connected to all this about it, and they took care of Jesse. Maybe that's what that's all about. Especially, I mean, it's really messed up considering the fact is that the dude on the bike is Jesse's friend. So maybe it's a situation much like Cupcake's situation that a lot of people in this circumstance are being blackmailed or manipulated. Maybe Tom is too, but once again, it seems like Tom is doing this because he wants to. Even Cupcake, you could see the reservations about doing what he did, so I don't know. I'm very interested, like, to find out who is really behind all this. Immediately my brain goes to possibly the governor's wife, especially because things are kind of escalating a little bit, because even though Serena hasn't died, I think like we're seeing the motions of everything going through the way it did originally, like them already being set on like, oh, maybe we should execute Danny, but having reservations about it because it's like, well, maybe people will look at you executing Danny for different reasons, that you're doing it for political reasons rather than doing it for like, oh, this is for the sake, this is to put a stamp on crime to make it so that people are less inclined to commit crimes and stuff like that. And but Serena's death did finally push it over the edge. It's like, oh, like the death of an innocent child, boom, it pushed it over the edge. But the thing is, the wife ends up constantly bringing up the fact, is that all the girls that died were younger than their son. And it's like, we got to get justice for their families. So ultimately, I was thinking like maybe she's behind this because she ran into because her and her husband had run into Grace before. And Grace was presenting evidence, and she kind of helped Grace pick it up and everything. But the governor kind of pushed past her and everything. So I don't know. Part of me wonders. I mean, obviously, it's got to be someone high in the ranks. And I don't think it's the governor. Maybe it is. But I was thinking, like, maybe it's his wife. Maybe we'll ultimately find out it's actually his son. Maybe that's what it might be all about, too. Like, maybe they're trying to, like, push it in the right direction without pushing too hard. Because if they push too hard, then it's going to look a little suspicious or something of wanting Danny dead. Because if Danny's dead, the less, less they kind of have to deal with. I mean, because the question is, why now, after all this time, have Danny killed? I guess it's more so like they wanted to wait for this opportunity to rise, because it's like if they took care of him any other way, it looks suspicious. So, but once again, also things are kind of falling into place and all. Like, I guess more so than anything, they had to make sure they gathered up all the evidence, make sure all the ducks are in a row before they take care of this whole situation, to make sure they got all the evidence they need and there's no other loose ends that need to be tied up. So maybe Danny's supposed to be the last strand of it, obviously, but prior to like Nico and Laura kind of digging into everything. So I don't know, maybe when it comes to the governor's wife, I'm completely off about that. It's just, she's kind of at the top of my suspect list, but now also as the son. So, but we'll just kind of have to wait and see about that. What I thought was kind of like the biggest kick in the teeth was the fact that Tom pulled that move and got Laura arrested. It's like, don't worry, honey, your mom's not well. She's sick. We're going to send her to the hospital. I was like, I knew this was going to happen. He kind of threatened like that kind of earlier in the season and stuff like that. Like, oh, like you're like the way you're talking a little crazy and stuff like that. From the very, very beginning, I knew that was always going to be a possibility. I guess even more so, like obviously the conversation of like, oh, you're just like your mom. Her mom's in like, very similar circumstances. So it's like for very different reasons, but I was like, just like all of it was foreshadowing to this moment. And it was just like at that moment, I'm like, ooh, it's like that is the biggest like middle finger to Tom you can give moment. It's like you just want to give him the double middle fingers for that. It's like, and he's doing on top of Serena, in front of Serena too, on top of all of that, making like Laura look crazy. Obviously they find a gun on her. It's like, oh my God, what were you doing with the gun and everything? And it's just like, ugh. What I'm glad is though, ultimately he walked away with nothing because Laura's not stupid. She's really smart. And so she kept the rings. She always have a backup plan. So it's like, you might have her locked up in a hospital, but you sure as hell don't have the ring. So ultimately, once again, I'm curious to know what he's getting out of this. He must be getting some like higher position or something like that. Maybe it's going to like put everything in position for him to be the next runner up for, senator or governor, whatever the case may be. Because this whole like thing is also about like, I forgot what the whole deal with the governor is. Is it like re-election to be governor, or is it, a senator, whatever the case may be? Maybe this is all about putting Tom, Tom shows like, oh, I'm good at all this, oh, look, all the work I've done for you. So now you can help me with your clout and your pull and put me in a position to become the next governor or the next senator or whatever. Maybe that's what this is all about for him, kind of making a power play and stuff like that. So, and once again, back to it, it's so sad. Like, you claim to almost be a good father and everything, and yet you manipulate not only your daughter, but your wife, and you're just, you act like you love her, but now it's like, it seems like almost like he doesn't care anymore. It's like doing everything you're doing, she knows the truth about everything, and it's like you're just doing this like to keep her locked up. It's like, what do you think that 72 hours is going to do? Maybe I guess he feels like if he gets it all settled, like Laura can't do anything anymore. It's like you're screwing with your marriage, but it doesn't. Once again, it doesn't seem like he cares. As long as he gets to the end goal, everything else is kind of trivia. It's like, maybe you could argue maybe he fell out of love with Laura a long time ago. The whole reason why he had an affair and everything, but I don't know. It just seems like you don't care anymore. And I feel like, the stability of your family should matter. You have your daughter and everything back, sure. But even then, you only wanted her back for the sake of getting a ring. So it's not like you even, just worst father of the year. It's all I can say. Because another thing about this episode too is the fact is that it's constantly pushing the narrative of like, yeah, Serena might be young, but she's not an idiot, because she starts snapping at her mom because it's like, okay, dad say he's coming over. You're saying we got to leave without like before dad gets. It's like, no, I want you to tell me the truth. What story are you writing? Are you lying to me? And it's like, oh, mom and dad are having this conversation. Why are you speaking in Spanish? Like, it's like, oh, don't have to worry about it. It's like she's trying to listen, and it's something that they brought up last episode, and it's just like I said, they're building upon it with each episode. It's like Serena's asking questions. She's like, I don't know what's going on. And arguably it's not like you could really explain it to her. Like, she has a right to know, but ultimately, I think what will ultimately happen is that she will listen to what her grandmother said last episode. It's like, no, that no matter what it is, you might not realize what it is, but everything your mom is doing is for your sake. So that's definitely going, like, I don't know. I'm curious to see what she has to say in the next episode with everything kind of transpiring the way it did. And like, Tom's going to have to come up with more and more excuses. He's still going to try and paint, Laura as crazy and everything. So I'm also curious what Nico did about the whole cupcake situation. Did he call that in or not? Either way, I'm very interested to see what goes down in the next episode, where all these new developments take us then. But really, that's all I want to talk about in this episode. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.